We've talked a lot over the years about the decline in the birth rate and the rapidly increasing number of young adults who are refusing to get married and have children. As much as we've discussed the subject, we still have not discussed it enough. It is one of the great crises facing our civilization at the present moment. When a society gives up on having children, it has given up on its future, it has given up on itself, and, well, that matters. That matters a lot. Now, of course, plenty of people are still having children. We haven't entered full-on children of men territory quite yet. Our population is still growing, just as the population of the world is still growing. But the growth is slowing, and we have long since crossed the crucial threshold in this country where our fertility rate is now below replacement level. We are no longer having enough babies to replace older people as they die off. And as a consequence, our population itself grows older and more top-heavy, and all kinds of complications follow from that. And those complications quickly turn into catastrophes. We've discussed many aspects of this problem, but it's a problem so deep and all-encompassing that there are always going to be new dimensions to explore. And a few days ago, the New York Times, engaging in another random act of journalism, as Rush Limbaugh used to call it, published a piece homing in on a facet of the birth rate decline that, until now, hadn't gotten much press, if any at all. The article is titled, quote, "The Unspoken Grief of Never Becoming a Grandparent." And the piece by Catherine Pearson has gotten a decidedly mixed reaction. Some people, myself included, found it to be a profoundly sad yet very empathetic and very interesting look at a group of people who are suffering in a unique way from our society's plummeting birth rate. But other people were angry and offended for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. But first, let's read a little bit of this article. It says, quote, "Lydia Burke, 56, has held on to her favorite copy of The Velveteen Rabbit since her 3 children, now in their 20s and 30s, were young. She loved being a stay-at-home mother and filled her family's home with books. All of her children could read before they started school," Miss Burke recalled with pride. "She hoped one day to be a cool grandma who would share her favorite stories with a new generation. But none of her children want to have kids. And though that decision is right for them," Miss Burke said, "it still breaks her heart. I don't have young children anymore, and now I'm not going to have grandchildren," she said. "So that part of my life is just over." Like Miss Burke, a growing number of Gen Xers and baby boomers are facing the sometimes painful fact that they are never going to become grandparents. A little more than half of adults 50 and older had at least one grandchild in 2021, down from nearly 60% in 2014. Amid falling birth rates, more U.S. adults say they're unlikely to ever have children for a variety of reasons, chief among them, they just don't want to. Now, the article continues along with more anecdotes along these lines. I'm not going to read them all here, but you should go find the article and read for yourself. They're quite sad, quite illuminating, though. And, there are many older people these days with children who swear they will never have children of their own. And the reasons they give for remaining childless in the article are all very similar. They point to the economy, the state of the world, climate change, of course, and so on. None of them feel they have any obligation to have kids and carry on the family name and the bloodline. They're thinking only about themselves and what would make them most comfortable. And they've decided that they're most comfortable being childless and alone. So their parents will just have to deal with the loneliness and grief that comes from that. That's the general attitude. It's also the attitude of many commenters on this article. There's plenty of sympathy for the would-be or want-to-be grandparents, but there's also a lot of this sort of thing, quote, "Boo-hoo, get over yourself. I chose not to have children. That was my choice, which was clear from day one with my spouse. He married me on those terms. I'm not responsible for my parents' happiness. They are. They tried to guilt me into it during the first few years I was married, but eventually gave up. It was never their choice to make." A lot of empathy there. A similar message in this comment says, quote, "I feel it's extremely self-centered of any person who expects others to make decisions that will make them happy. Too many parents try to live their lives vicariously through their children. Children do not owe their parents everything. Besides, many of us were forced to babysit our younger children. I had 18 years of watching my 3 younger siblings and having to work in my mother's daycare center. My God, if I had my own children, I would have ended up spending my entire life raising children. My purpose in life is not to watch/raise children. With the recent parental theory practice of making the oldest child the third parent, making them help raise their younger siblings, you can expect that more people will reject parenthood when they become adults." I have to clarify one thing here. This is a theme that we're going to see emerge. in these people that reject having kids is that they just have no understanding of history at all. They have no clue. They just have no idea what human history consists of. Not even like the foggiest general idea, because it is not a recent theory that older children should help care for their younger siblings. This is not like a recent phenomenon. This is how all human societies have worked since the dawn of our species. This commenter is suggesting that more people are rejecting parenthood because they were raised in the same way that billions of humans have been raised since time immemorial. And again, this is a common theme. People with absolutely no understanding of human history have decided that the challenges they face are utterly unprecedented, when in fact, they have not dealt with a single thing that billions of other people haven't also dealt with. And those billions of people still had families in spite of it. Now, this article also went viral on X, as you would expect, and the commentary there, very similar. Couple of examples, quote, "Unspoken? My parents never shut the F up about wanting grandkids. Don't F up the economy for your children and then get surprised when they can't afford kids." Then another one says, "These grandparents should have built enough generational wealth so their kids would feel financially secure enough to start a family. The unspoken grief of not being a trust fund Nepo baby who can easily support a family." Now, obviously, we hear this excuse constantly. We're told that people aren't having kids today because of the economy. And, the economy makes it impossible, I've been told. This person blames the birth rate decline on a lack of generational wealth. And let me reiterate a point that I made on Twitter, which seems to have upset a lot of people. And now I'm going to upset them again because I'll say it again. The economy is not preventing anyone from starting a family or having children. Okay? It's not preventing anyone. Now, I'm not denying that the economy is in poor shape at the moment, but that is not a good reason or a valid reason for a society to give up on the family. If anything, it's all the more reason not to give up on the family. What do you think happens to the economy when everybody gets older and you don't have enough younger people coming up the ranks? You think that makes the economy better? Is that going to solve the problem? And also, you don't need generational wealth to start a family, okay? You don't need to be this is what we're hearing. You have to be a trust fund Nepo baby to simply have a kid. You have to be a multi-millionaire living in extreme luxury to afford even a single child. I mean, this is the kind of mentality that many people have now. It's totally delusional. I did not have any generational wealth when I started my family. And those of you who've listened to this show for a long time are familiar with my story. I was broke when I got married. The economy wasn't exactly humming at the time either. There's another thing I'm told all the time by people, younger people especially, when they're trying to justify that they don't want to have kids. They'll say, well, you don't know what it's like. You don't know with the economy. You don't know what it's like. Do you think this is the only time there's been a bad economy? Do you really think that? The economy crashed when I was in my early 20s. It's called the Great Recession. Okay, big crash. Wasn't all that long ago. So that's the situation I was in when I was just entering young adulthood. Okay? Couldn't afford a house. I was living in an apartment on a meager salary. So broke, I frequently had to pay for gas with the spare change in the cup holder in my car. And we weren't in much better shape when we had our first 2 kids. We didn't buy our first house until we had already had 3 kids. You don't need to be rich to start a family. You do not need to come from a rich family to start a family. You don't need a strong economy. Economies ebb and flow, okay? They go up and they go down. If you ever have kids, okay, here's the thing. If you ever have kids, if you ever have them, it is guaranteed that you will have kids during a weak economy. And the reason is that it may be strong when you have them, but you'll still be a parent 10 years from then when the economy dips again. The economy may be weak now when you have kids, but you'll be a parent 10 years from now when it's stronger. This is how economies work. And that's why you can't wait around for the economy to permit you to move on with your life and do the things that you're meant to do as a human being. Now, I use my own story as an example because it's my own story. Also because it's important that when I talk about this, that you know that I've actually done the thing that I'm advocating for, which makes me more credible with discussing this, not less. But of course, even at my brokest point, I was still then rich compared to the vast majority of humans who've ever lived on Earth. And you right now listening to this, no matter what your financial situation is, you are richer than almost everyone who has ever lived. Okay, people with fewer resources than you have been reproducing since the beginning of human existence. Literally billions of people have done the thing that we are now told you can't do unless you have $100,000 in savings. If people had this attitude in the past, the human species would not exist. So if this is your attitude, you have an attitude that if this was prevalent 200 years ago, it would be the extinction of mankind. Like, that's not an exaggeration. Nobody wants to talk about debt, but here's the cold hard truth. Many of us will get deeper in debt during the holidays. Last year, half of American consumers took on debt just to pay for Christmas presents and holiday expenses. This year, it could be you, could be me. And let me tell you something, it's never too early to start planning your way out of all of that. That's where my friends at PDS Debt come in with a personalized solution just for you. Look, I've seen what debt can do to families. If you're making payments every month and your balances aren't going down, you're stuck in exactly the kind of trap that PDS Debt specializes in breaking you out of. Here's what makes them different. Everyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies, no minimum credit score required. They even accept bad and fair credit, and they'll help you save more while paying off your debt in a fraction of the time. Whether you're struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills, PDS Debt will look at your specific situation and find alternative solutions to get you debt-free. They don't just treat you like a number, they actually take the time to understand your specific scenario. Start planning today. Get a free debt analysis right now at pdsdebt.com/Walsh. It only takes 30 seconds. That's pdsdebt.com/Walsh, pdsdebt.com/Walsh. So you say that you can't afford to start a family. Well, how can that be? How can it be that you can't afford it, and yet billions of people have afforded it with less? How is it that you can't do something that has been done under more difficult circumstances billions of times? And I'm often told by younger people that the situation now is just too difficult. Everything's too expensive, and I don't understand. I can't relate. Again, it's like they think the history of the world started 45 minutes ago. If you think the challenges you face today are so unprecedented that they mean we should stop reproducing as a species, then you simply have no understanding of world history. You don't know what the world was like. You don't know what your ancestors had to deal with. You don't even know what people 10 years older than you had to deal with. People have been through recessions, depressions, famines, wars, catastrophes of all kinds, and they continued having children. They continued building families. Sure, fertility rates have gone up and down over the years and decades, but there's never been a time when mass amounts of young adults have simply sworn off parenthood altogether. That has never happened until now. Do you really think you face greater hurdles than your great-great-grandparents did during the Great Depression? Do you really think it's harder to have a family now than it was when the Black Death was wiping out a third of the population of Europe? Yes, these days, young families may struggle to buy a starter home, and that's a struggle. I'm not dismissing it. I struggled with that too in my early 20s. Look, if there was ever a time when it was easy for someone in their 20s to afford a nice home, that time lasted for like 30 seconds 40 years ago, okay? It was never like that before. It hasn't been like that since. It'll probably never be like that again. So just get over it, okay? Just get over it. You have no choice. Most people in the history of the earth could never dream of living in any kind of home at all. In fact, for most people who've ever lived, the greatest challenge in starting a family was not a starter home. It was that half of their kids wouldn't live past infancy. And yet they still started families. They still forged on. The truth is that the economy is not stopping anyone from having kids. It's not that they can't afford it. It's that they don't want to make the sacrifices it requires. They'd have to give up a certain measure of comfort in order to start a family, and they don't want to do that. For most of the people who say they can't afford kids, that's what they mean. That's how we can end up in a situation where someone says they can't afford kids, even though they're wealthier and more comfortable than billions of people who somehow could afford it. It's because what they really mean to say is that they can't afford the same level of luxury and comfort while also having kids. It's not really a matter of affordability, it's a matter of priority. A lot of people today prioritize their own pleasure and enjoyment over anything and everything else. Another one of the comments under the article that I read was from a woman who said that her household income between herself and her husband is $150,000 and they can't afford to have a kid. Household income of $150K, they can't afford it. There are people out there making a tenth of that who have kids. Okay, they can't afford it at $150K. And that's it right there. Like, that is the attitude. It's that sort of thing that has led to the birth rate decline. The irony, of course, is that, you so often end up with far less pleasure and enjoyment. When you prioritize that above all, you end up with less of it than people who don't prioritize it. The truth is that you can start a family and have kids, and then down the line end up far richer than you were when you were childless. I'm a testament to that. Millions of other examples are available to you. I mean, this is not an uncommon thing, especially these days. It's possible to do. But one of the most basic realities of life is that if you want more, you have to be willing to risk what you already have. You have to put your chips on the table. If you won't do that, you'll be stuck in exactly the spot you're in right now forever. Until eventually, you lose that too. And that brings me to the final point that I want to make. We heard those responses to the New York Times article from people who insisted quite indignantly that they don't owe it to anyone to have kids. But actually, you kind of do. And nobody will tell you this, okay? Nobody will talk about the obligation to start a family. The idea that any of us have any obligations at all is, of course, anathema to the modern mind. We are deeply distressed by the thought that we owe anything to anyone ever. But, you could be distressed about it all you want. I will say what no one else will say to you. You do actually owe it. You have a duty. Now, there are exceptions. Some people are called to a life of service apart from biological parenthood. Some people simply can't have kids. I get that. There are other vocations that human beings can have, but most of us are called to start families. And for those of us who are called, we do owe it. We do have a debt. We're called. We are called to it. Your ancestors suffered and bled and died to build the civilization you live in now and to give you all of the comforts and luxuries that you take for granted. They lived lives that were, by our standards, brutal and short and impoverished. They built their lives by hand from scratch. They built the civilization that you live in from scratch. You think you can't afford children. Well, you have a grandfather not all that far back in your lineage who built a one-bedroom cabin by hand, shared it with your grandmother and 8 kids, one of whom gave birth to the person who gave birth to the person who gave birth to the person who gave birth to you. You experience more comfort and luxury in a single day than that man did in his entire life combined. His life would have been easier if he never had kids, but he had them because he wanted you to exist. He was actually thinking 100 years into the future, 200 years, 300 years. You come from a long line of people who actually cared about what the world would look like in the distant future, even as you only care about what you're going to have for lunch this afternoon. And you don't have just one grandfather like that. Your bloodline was carried on through the centuries by men and women of that type. They carried your family name and your lineage and your history and everything that makes you, you. They carried it on their backs and they suffered for its sake. And now after all of that, after those thousands of years of struggle and strife, just to bring you into this world, you're going to shrug your shoulders and refuse to continue? They ran marathons, handed you the baton, and you're going to just sit down in a lawn chair and say, sorry, you wasted your efforts. The race ends here. I don't feel like running. I don't feel like it. Nah. All of that is going to end with you going, nope. You're going to wipe out your lineage and bloodline just so you have more time to watch Netflix? Thousands of years of toil end with you by your own choice because you just can't be bothered? That is a failure of historic proportions. It is a failure to live up to your obligation because, yes, you have an obligation to the people who built this world. You have an obligation to continue what they built. Now, I'm not saying, I know that what I'm saying here is not going to be the most compelling argument to most people these days. I know that. And I know that a lot of people it's going to get shared on Twitter. People are going to snicker about it. And this is dumb. We have an obligation to our ancestors, continue the lineage. That's stupid. Who cares about, there'll be a lot of that, I get it. Because to a lot of people these days, the idea that they should have any respect for their ancestors, much less that they have any obligations to them, is totally foreign. Now, I realize that. We are a culture severed from its own past, living in a perpetual state of now, as though the past never happened and the future will never happen. That's how you end up with people who act as though they're facing unprecedented financial hardships because they can't afford to buy a 3-bedroom house at the age of 23. I understand all that. But what I'm saying is still true, all the same. So, if your parents are sad that you aren't giving them any grandchildren, this is why. They have every right to be sad. They are mourning not only their own loneliness, but also the fact that you're choosing to squander 10,000 years of work. They're mourning the extinction of their bloodline. And they're wondering what the point of any of this ever was. If it all ends like this, it all ends with you for no good reason. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.